ENTOTA and Proceed Archiving have formed a joint alliance to take customers the very best solutions around archiving and data migration. Nick, can you tell me a bit very quickly about Proceed?
Proceed, going 10 years, 250 projects in the UK, real specialists in the archiving market.
ENTOTA, dedicated in SAP EIM technology. That's all we do, formed from a load of ex-consultants from SAP. We specialise around data migration, governance and quality. Together, we don't believe there's any better company out there offering this solution. A lot of companies don't actually think that data migration is that difficult. But if you think about what can go wrong, it's all about making sure the data that gets into your new application is of optimal quality, that if your return on investment is sound, and the money you're spending on SAP is returned.
I mean, one of the problems I go into customers, and they keep talking about they need to migrate their data. Is it a big topic?
It's huge. It's one of those topics that people usually underestimate, and they think it's a technical task of moving my data from my legacy systems into my SAP landscape, and it's an easy topic.
So where typically do you start with one of these projects then?
Well, the first thing is actually getting the customer to recognise it's a problem. You know, if you look at people spending huge amounts of money on SAP, whether it's an upgrade, a consolidation, maybe a divestiture, you know, they've got to realise that if they don't get the right data in there, they could have post-go-live disruption, they could have poor user adoption, they could have delayed projects and substantial cost and impact and risk to the business.
But you talk about right data. I mean, typically the quality of data is also a problem, isn't it? So do you tend to get the quality of data right?
It's all about quality. I mean, you know, data migration is really a data quality project. It's about looking at the business processes as they should be and looking at how to structure the data in the optimal way to make sure that business process will run absolutely efficiently once you go live.
And then, you know, what are the steps? So where do we start? Where do we finish?
So once we've got the customer actually realising that actually this is pretty important, the first thing is to actually assess the data quality and look at the data that they've got in their existing landscape against the scope of the project that they're coming through. So just to sum up, data migration is about taking the assets you've got in your legacy system, transforming it in the optimal fashion into your new SAP landscape and giving the business the confidence that that's been done in an absolutely efficient way.
If a customer's already decided they want to do a data migration project, I mean, where do they basically start?
The first thing is really to understand the quality of the data that you've got. You know, and how do you do that? You could use things like Excel, which may be appropriate, or you may want to go a little bit further and take tools like Data Services and Information Steward, where I can actually extract all that data using this sort of technology into a staging area and apply some data quality techniques onto the data.
So what kind of data quality techniques can you use? I mean, say typically names and addresses, you've got, you know, multiples in there, the wrong postcodes. So how do you go about cleaning that type of data up? I
think that's part of it. That's the most common thing when people talk about data quality, it's about names and addresses. That's actually probably the easier thing to sort out. The real difficult thing in migration is to look at the business process as it should run and the data quality as it should fit the new business process. And that could be things like mandatory fields. It might be about business transformation rules. It may be about how do I populate a field if the data doesn't exist in my legacy system. It's about getting all this stuff understood using this sort of data audit type approach.
So on the projects that you've done, I mean, do you always find data quality issues?
All the time. And it's getting those data qualities understood way up front in the project to make sure you don't get any nasty surprises down the line. So the data audit is the fundamental thing you need to get right up front to reduce the risk of your project.
And then once you've got that data, once you know what data problems you've got, how do you actually clean that data up?
It depends on the complexity of the project. You can use tools like Excel if it's a simple migration, or you use tools like Data Services with its data quality techniques where you can start applying these quality rules using, you know, deduplication techniques, standardization and matching techniques, all pre-built within the technology itself. And that will visualize the quality back to the business in nice little graphics and a nice user interface.
These data migration projects are huge projects for customers. You know, what data do you start with?
So in every business process in SAP has a list of specific data objects that you need to migrate into. and each of those objects will have the definitions. So it's really starting to look at that target data design, which is really defining what data should look like as it goes into SAP. So we call that data design within our ENTOTA business. Then it's about going back to your legacy system, extracting the data, profiling the hell out of it to make sure you really understand what it is, and then trying to do a gap analysis between the two. So I need to work out what's missing, what needs to be transformed, etc., to meet that new data design. As part of that, it's about identifying what active records you need to move across. And why that's important is because if you can reduce the number of active records to as small number as possible, that's going to reduce the cost and risk of your project. At that point, you need to decide then, if I'm moving active records across, what do I do with the inactive records, and therefore what is my archiving strategy going to be at this point in time?
Will you automate the process completely, or will you look at the data and go, I've only got a small amount of data here, so it's a rekeying exercise?
Absolutely. I mean, so as part of the ENTOTA methodology, we have a data migration portal which we use, which is all pre-configured to jumpstart projects. And as part of that, you look at each object, and as part of your profiling, you go, if it's low volume, then I could do a manual process. I might just use Excel. If it's a complicated bit of data, I might use data services and information steward to profile it and then migrate that across, which will be automated. And then you decide what the load cycles are for that particular data object. First thing you need to do is actually define a data migration strategy. Is it a one-off migration? Is it something that I need to repeat again and again and again? Is it a multi-year rollout with multi-regions running in parallel? Each of those will have a different flavour of solution, and you can't necessarily have a one-fit-all on each approach.
Do you typically, is it all automated? Is it some manual?
If you're running a migration, I have a list of business processes I need to migrate data into. Each business process will have a list of data objects associated with it. You start looking at that and you profile the data and work out, for each object, am I doing an automated load? Am I doing a manual load? Am I using Excel? Am I using an ETL tool like data services? And you assign that as part of your data design as you go through the first planning phases.
And what tools do you provide to help with that process?
So we use tools like data services, which is our industry-leading ETL tool, and tools like information steward for profiling.
There's lots of companies out there claiming that they do data migration. What makes ENTOTA different from the rest, really?
Great question, Nick. Thank you very much. The key and the company ethos, which is different within ENTOTA, I mean, a lot of our guys have come from SAP. We've got a lot of SAP techno-functional experience. A lot of companies think that migration is an ETL or a technical project. The difference with ENTOTA is we focus more on the data design as the critical aspect of our migration, and that's really defining in a collaborative environment what the data should look like before it moves into SAP, rather than starting with a technical build when you actually don't know what the data design is. So the fundamental difference is more effort is spent on data design. We have tools and techniques where we can automate code from that data design to reduce the cost of your build. The skill is having the SAP techno-functional skills to work on the data design to reduce the cost and risk of your project.
And if you've got that kind of design and execution, those two stages, typically what's the split, Clive, in terms of, do you spend 50% doing the design, 50% doing the execution?
Yeah. And again, this comes back to the ethos. Most companies will spend more time and more money on build. We disagree with that. We think you should spend more money on data design and getting the quality right to reduce the risk, and less money on build, and which is how we actually cut costs and reduce risks on projects. So more time data design, less time on build.
I mean, one of the questions that customers are going to ask is, they've got all of this data, whether it be in their SAP system or their legacy system, and typically because they've been going years with this data, the quality of the data gets poor.
Mm-hmm.
How do you help with that?
Well, again, understanding what poor means, what poor is, and what impact it could have on the new business process. Poor quality data may be fine for some companies in certain areas. There are certain aspects of a business process which absolutely need high quality data. So it's actually trying to work out where to spend your time on the quality, which is important.
And how do you measure that? Do you go in there and look at the data they've got and go, well, this is okay, this data's not so good, this data's very, very poor? So do you
Absolutely.
assess that?
Yeah, and that's all about data audit, profiling, working with the business users to actually help them understand the impact of quality on the new business process.
Once you've assessed that, how then do you actually start to improve that quality?
So again, it's working on the data design of the new SAP application. So I'm rolling out SAP, or I'm doing an upgrade or consolidation. What does good look like in that system? And then it's transforming what you've got against what it should look like. Key quality indicators to actually help the business understand, is the data improving, and the levels of quality of that data. And then as part of our data design portal, or migration design portal, they can flag which bits of data are high importance for quality and which are less important, and where to put the focus.
Do you find, certainly with an SAP system, that data is poorer quality in certain modules than others?
Again, it depends on the industry. So as a rule, no. Every business is different. Typically, customers, vendors, materials are the most important areas to get right, and we have sort of techniques and solutions for actually helping customers through that pain.
And have you found customers that have got a huge amount of poor quality data?
Oh yes, and then it's a question of prioritising which bits to get right. If I've got 10,000 vendors, I only want to improve the quality of the ones in the first phase where I'm spending the most money, or focusing on customers which are my primary tier 1 customers. And again, it's part of our approach and profiling techniques to actually help them identify what bits to focus on.
Clive, we talked how you can do a data migration project technically, but how do you get the business involved? How do you start this off?
So, the biggest problem with any migration is getting the business to realise it's their problem. It is business's responsibility, facilitated by IT, to define what the data should look like before it gets into SAP.
Yeah, but we know from our archiving projects that the problem is the business don't really want to know about this. They kind of leave it to IT. So how do you get the business involved?
Yeah, so that's a very good point. Typically, people try and do this thing with spreadsheets, documents, and it becomes very difficult to manage and difficult for the business to engage. So at ENTOTA, we've got this data migration portal, which is a web application that allows the business to see the migration process in business-centric view. So they can see what they're responsible for. They can see what data objects are in scope for themselves. They can see the progress of the data quality. They can look at the business rules that are defined for each object. So that translates what they see as a technical project into something that actually they can own and manage. Once that's done, then it's IT's responsibility to take that design that the business is accountable for and translate that into a technical solution. And this is where our code generator that we have for data services takes that design and automatically builds the whole end-to-end process for migration and dramatically cuts the costs of a migration project. But in summary, it's a business problem. Business own the quality of data, and it's your responsibility to manage it. IT a responsibility for executing against that data design. So, as you know, we do a lot of work together around the archiving and migration space. We go into customers talking about data migration, and the first thing we do is sort of say, what are your active records that you need to migrate across? And that reduces the cost of the migration, but then we say to the customer, okay, the inactive records you need to do something with. So they need to archive it in some way. What options are available to the client?
Well, basically, SAP have already built the archiving solution for customers. So the thing called archive objects, which enable you to take the data out of the system and put them into flat files, and gradually you move the data from your live system into the archive.
That sounds really simple.
And it is quite simple. I mean, it's a well tried and tested solution. Thousands of customers have actually got it working.
Which technology is this?
So this is basically standard SAP technology. It's been there since 1996. We've done over 250 projects using this technology in the UK. Great response time back from the archive. Okay. So we've archived the data out, whether it be finance, whether it be SD. Yeah, so every part of your system can get archived, and you can bring that back into your standard SAP transactions.
So what two options do I have available in summary? If I want to archive data out from SAP, what do I use?
So I use the archive development kit, which is standard,
Yep.
okay, and I also need a content server to store my archive files in.
We work together on projects, we migrate the data into SAP, and then the customer is left with a load of inactive records in a plethora of different systems. It could be structured data, it could be unstructured data, but presumably there's some sort of requirement, be it legal or whatever, to archive that data. So what kind of data do I need to consider when I'm archiving data during that sort of project?
Well, as you talked about, Clive, there's structured and unstructured data. Your structured data is your transactional data, so that's your standard FI transactions. And then we have unstructured data, which are things like invoices, purchase orders. So what we're trying to do here is keep the structured data online for as long as you need it. So typically finance transactions for 2 years, and then you need to put a further 5 into the archive, giving you 7 years, which is your HMRC requirement for that data. Unstructured data, purchase orders, there is no legal requirement. Typically you would keep them for a year, but for invoices, for instance, again, HMRC need to actually look at those, so you typically want to keep them for 7 years.
So you need some sort of archiving strategy as well at some point, presumably.
Correct, Clive. And
is that something you advise clients on?
Yeah, and that's one of the first parts of the project, is to actually advise them on that strategy.
We go into customers, we talk about archiving strategy, and we sort of basically hand over to you to say, you know, what do they need to do? I hear lots of sort of terminology floating around the archiving community, which are a little bit confusing for customers. So what are those sort of general topics that people need to consider when they look at their archiving strategy?
Okay. Well, typically what you have is 2 sets of dates really for an archiving project. One is your residency time, which is how long you keep the data online for, and the next one is your retention time, how long you keep it in the archive for. So the residency plus the retention time is the length of time you keep your data.
And is that the same kind of technology I'm using for that, or is that different bits of technology?
No, it's all standard SAP technology. You know, you set the residency time in SAP, and then you set the retention time, and at the end of the retention time, the system will actually delete that data out of the system.
And that's all in ILM?
And that's all a part of the Information Lifecycle Management project and products. They do other things as well. They do decommissioning, so you can decommission SAP and non-SAP systems.
Okay.
Yeah, as well as standard archiving.
And that's different, is it? That's a different approach? Or is that the same kind of methodology and approach?
What I'd say is ILM is super archiving, so brand new, but also with ILM you get the chance to do this decommissioning as well.
I hear lots of people talking about archiving, and I hear things thrown around like ILM and OpenText, and what do I use and when? And then if I'm doing legacy to an archive and SAP to an archive, what do I use?
Right, yeah, it is quite confusing. OpenText is a standard SAP content server where you can put archive files.
Sorry, what's a content server?
A content server, a piece of software that enables you to protect those archive files from deletion. It also manages those archive files for you. So SAP recommends that when you do archiving, you put them into a content server, an OpenText or one of these.
Right.
Okay?
So ILM is not a content server?
So ILM's not a content server. When you use ILM, you need to actually store those archive files either in a content server or on a piece of ILM-enabled hardware. Right. So you can get hardware from IBM, Hitachi, HP, NetApps that are all ILM aware.
So do I need ILM and OpenText then when I'm doing a project?
Well, yeah, unfortunately you do, because basically you would store your data in ILM, but your unstructured data, which is your documents, you will need OpenText to do that.
I mean, can you justify to clients spending money on this archiving technology will actually benefit?
Well, the actual ILM hardware is comparatively quite cheap. Typically for a content server, it's based on the number of users. But again, if you've got 2,000 SAP users, typically you won't have 2,000 content users. You will have a much smaller number because only a small number of people are going to use that data.
Archiving sounds terribly expensive, Nick. Sounds incredibly expensive, and I want to keep it to the bare minimum. You know, I do a migration project. I see the value in that because I can get high quality data into my SAP landscape. But surely this archiving thing is just a bit of a waste of money, isn't that? How can you really justify all this spend on archiving, and what's the business benefits of doing so?
Well, I mean, if you just look at the cost of disk storage for an SAP system, tier 1 disk storage, Gartner did a project a few years ago and actually said anywhere between 50 and 150,000 pounds per terabyte for tier 1 disk storage for SAP. So, you know, most customers that we talk to have 2 or 3 terabytes in their production system. Then they might have a disaster recovery, got QA, got test systems. So across their landscape, they might have 10, 12 terabytes. If I can halve that, I can probably save them maybe £750,000 just in disk storage alone.
So hang on, let me just repeat that. So what you're saying, basically, we go through the migration, we identify the active and inactive records, we migrate the high quality stuff into SAP.
Yep.
That reduces the volumes there.
Yep.
And then you're saying now the archiving stuff we can then put somewhere else and dramatically reduce the cost of my SAP architecture.
Correct. And the other thing, of course, is we're not putting it on tier 1 storage, we're putting it on much cheaper tier 3 storage, so the actual storage of the archive is very cheap.
Right, so are you saying that when you go and do an archive strategy or have a conversation with the customer, you can actually quantify how much money you can reduce their SAP architecture by doing some archiving?
Yeah, typically we'll not even do that as part of the project. We'll do that completely up front. So we go into a customer, look at the size of their database, apply these retention periods and residency periods to the data, and come up with a model which shows you how much data we could actually remove to the archive.
How long does that take?
Typically a couple of weeks to do. We give them a couple of standard SAP transactions to run. We have some software back at base which does all the manipulation, and then we come back with a report to actually show them how much savings they could actually make.
Right, Nick, I've got a client I'm talking to at the moment, big enterprise client. They've got legacy environment, they want to migrate data off that, and they want to move on to SAP. They've got some old legacy systems they need to turn off and move up into an archive and move some active records across to my new SAP system. How do I approach the archiving in that sort of situation when I've got SAP data and I've got non-SAP?
Okay, so using SAP's Information Lifecycle Management product, ILM, I do standard archiving for the SAP data. Right. So if my data's sitting in my nice shiny SAP system, I can archive that data. But I may have then non-SAP data. Okay, and the first thing I've got to do is a data migration project. So I've got to get it into a particular format, so I can get it into SAP, and from there I can then decommission it into my decommission warehouse.
Well, hang on a minute. Are you saying I need to migrate from my legacy into SAP and then archive, or am I doing a migration from my legacy directly into ILM once I've transformed those objects into SAP?
Right. So I'm basically taking my legacy data. I've got to do a data migration.
Into where?
Basically into a set of tables that SAP can actually pick up. Okay.
SAP or ILM?
No, well, ILM, SAP and ILM, same thing.
ILM,
all right. So basically, once I've got those that data into my ILM tables, my ILM system can then pick that up and put it into my decommission warehouse.
How do you approach when you're doing an archiving project, what records you should archive and what you shouldn't?
Okay, so typically the first thing to do is look at the size of the database. So we will get the customer to extract all of the SAP tables. We will then look to see what those tables actually contain.
How do you get them to? Do you just sort of say, how do you do that?
So we use some standard SAP transactions. We get them.
And you give the customer that?
Give them a customer cheat sheet of how to actually run that data. They produce that data in 2 Excel spreadsheets for us.
Excel spreadsheet, I suppose it's high volume.
No. You know, 100,000 tables in your SAP system,
Yeah.
but typically most of the data, 90% of the data, in the top 250 tables.
Right.
So all we're literally going to do is table name and the size of the table.
Oh, okay, gotcha, okay.
We know
Not the actual data itself.
Not the actual data
Yeah,
itself.
yeah.
We know what's actually contained in that table. Our software back at base will actually then look at that, apply residency and retention times,
Yeah.
and then we can actually give the customer a report back to actually show them, if we were doing an archive project, this is how much you could possibly save from doing that archiving on that particular table.
So it sounds like the difference between our approaches, which are complementary, is that you look at the actual specific technicalities of a table, whereas we will look at the content of the data using tools like Data Service and Information Steward and show the business where their most active customers are, who's actually spent the most money, where they're spending money with their vendors, etc.
Correct.
Which is a somewhat different approach, but you need both to come up with your archiving strategy.
Correct.
When you're defining a strategy for a client around archiving, who needs to be involved in that process, and where does the responsibility lie between people like IT and the business?
The strategy is very much similar to your data migration strategy in that IT are there because they need to be there. You know, they're going to be responsible for running the archive at some time in the future, but it's all down to the business really. You've got to take the business with you. Unfortunately, that word archive has terrible connotations of dingy basement with cobwebs and files. So basically the whole part of an archiving project is to get those users to accept that they can get their data back from the archive.
I mean, do you go in places and people go, wow, it's archiving, you know, do people really understand the legal implications of what they're actually responsible for?
I think in the very large organisation, especially if you're in a regulated industry, whether it be FDA or FSA, then they understand. Smaller companies, I mean, we've been into a number of companies where they say, well, let's just delete the data, let's not archive. Okay, and we have to explain to them, you know, you have legal requirements for this data.
Do people get fined if that happens? Is that?
Well, you no, get fined, but you can also get sent to jail.
Okay, that's fairly compelling. How big is my team size likely to be for an archiving project?
Well, typically you're going to have 1 or 2 people from IT, and then say, for instance, you're doing FICO, SD, you'll have a couple of super users and people from the business. Yep. So what you don't want is archiving by committee. You don't want 25 people in the room all trying to make a decision, otherwise the project's actually not going to happen.
Right, so what, 3 people, 10 people, 1 person?
I'd say if you're doing FICO and SD, you're probably talking about a 4 or 5 person project. That's it.
Full time?
No, part-time.
Okay.
Part-time. And I'd say if you want duration, I'd say the actual archive strategy bit, the upfront blueprint, will probably take 20 to 30 days, and then realisation another 20 to 30 days.
Yeah.
Yeah, but typically part-time, because we actually have to send the users away to do some homework in terms of finding out information. So it is not a full-time activity.
So it's not as scary as some people think?
No, lots of people go archiving, or too expensive, going to take too long. It's not like that at all.